Dances of Us shares the journeys of dancers and communities from underrepresented backgrounds. Each episode highlights how movement becomes a language of identity, memory, resistance, and hope. Hello, my name is Lerna, and I am the host of Dances of Us podcast. Lichen Bouboushian is a genderqueer artist from Texas with a history of practice in Chicago and New York City, and family ties to Lebanon and Armenia. They work within dance, experimental music, noise, and performance art. They build a rhizomatic practice through visible forays into performances and workshopping, and less visible forays into creating, writing, dialogue, modes of care and support, and resource sharing. They utilize self-exposure and vulnerability in real, risky ways and produce thought-provoking commentary on social limits. They have performed in various festivals in Seattle, Madison, Athens, Beirut, Berlin, and New York. They have shared their interdisciplinary teaching practice at universities in Kentucky, Beirut, and Mexico. They created and hosted a seasonal interdisciplinary performance series at the Glue, New York City. Lichen is joining us today from Texas, Rosanki, which was the native land of Tankawa and Coahuitecan tribes. She is in a white painted room with an open kitchen behind. She wears a grey top with the black patterns. She has dark brown hair and blue eyes with fair skin. Hello, Lichen. Welcome to our Dances of Us podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I want to start with our questions today. Can you tell us about your earliest memories of dance?
Yes, and I love this question. I actually made a short piece involving the answer to this question. So my earliest memories of being enthralled by movement. Um, so I was born in Texas, which is where I live again now. And as many people might know, football is a very big deal in Texas. I was a child in the 90s. During which time the Dallas Cowboys team was doing very well. We had Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith and Deion Sanders, these like players who are now just like household names. I wasn't really interested in football, but my parents and my brother loved it. So every like Monday night football was like the big broadcast, right? Like that was the big deal. There were the Sunday games as well, but Monday night football was the big deal. And every time the
Hmm.
theme song came on, which was like a country song, I would do what I thought was breakdancing. It was definitely not. Like, I'm sure no one ever filmed me, right? My family didn't have that kind of technology at the time. But if someone had filmed me, they would be like, this child is having a problem. This child is like rolling around. But I would just like whip my limbs in all directions and be on the floor. And it really makes sense because like I'm a modern dancer now, you know? So
Yes,
like it
yes.
makes sense that like rolling on the floor felt like the most exciting thing. Um, and so, yeah, that is my earliest memory. And because of that, I injured myself. I still have a scar.
Oh,
I hit my head on the like kitchen island somehow when I was like up and whipping around. I'm okay. I was fine, but I have a thing for scars also. Like I've loved it when I'm like I have a bruise or something to show for like my performance. And because of that movement, my mom was like, we have to put this kid in dance classes. So I was like 5 years old and bless my mother, she was like very supportive of that. Through has always been supportive throughout my life, but she saw something in me where she was like, we need to channel this somewhere. You
yes,
know?
yes.
Yeah.
So she channeled this energy to the right direction, what I am understanding, because what you were doing as a young child by the football space, it was like kind of interpretation of a contemporary dance, probably early ages of contemporary dance in your body, the reflections were coming out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, before I knew what it was, which is kind of a theme in my trajectory as an artist. Like I'll
Yeah.
do something and then someone will say, do you realize what this artist has been doing? And I'm like, oh, that person is my forebear. I'm actually in their lineage without knowing it, which I think is a really interesting thing that can happen. And then to sort of place yourself in that is really cool. So yeah, it definitely tracks in that way. It makes sense that I ended up where I am.
Yeah, in relation to that, before having this podcast with you, I watched some of your performances online and I find your performances evoking, provoking, and refreshing. And it was very brave to touch to some words, bring some topics to the stage or the performance space. I have many things to tell about that, but I'm keeping some of them to later. And how then dance become a language of refuge for you that it makes you opens up you a space to make all these performances.
Mm. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching my work and for yeah, for seeing the what's evocative and the bravery in it. Bravery is very important to me. This is going to sound like kind of a scientific beginning to this answer, but I think now it's really in the cultural zeitgeist, so it makes sense that this is coming up for me. It's a space of regulation, of of like nervous system
Mm,
regulation. I think that's what I was doing in part as a child, right? Going back to that memory, there was all this excitement around me that I didn't understand because I'm still not a sports person. I still don't get it. And it's like that was how I was channeling it into something where I was like, well, there's this crazy energy happening around me. I'm gonna like move it in, literally move it into something else, literally move through it. And so that for me is the same for dealing with various kinds of social positionings I experience, both privileges and oppressions that I experience. So the literal space to move through those things, and as I have developed my practice and it's included more somatic work, like if we go back to this nervous system regulation thing, right? The vagus nerve is like something people talk about more, right? This like central nerve where it's like moving so much of my work and has like involved like some kind of undulation there that like that's also why I work with my voice. It like hits all of it, right? So
yeah,
this kind of ability to move through and I would say alchemize what we experience is the reason I also always return to dance, despite the fact that some people sometimes it can be harder to see the dance in what I'm doing, if that makes sense. It's not always the most forefronted thing, or it seems like a smaller part of a whole, when in fact it's actually the foundation of everything I do. When I make anything, I have to have space to move first, even if I'm recording music, which I also do, right?
yeah,
Anything that I'm making, I usually need a space where I can lie on the floor, where I can have space to move around, even if it doesn't look like the most dance like moving around, right? And I work with a really expanded version of dance. And based on your questions, it seems like you do too sometimes, right? Like this,
yeah,
because dance can be so many things, right? And
yeah.
so yeah, that's how I would say dance functions as a refuge for me. I feel like I can always come back to it that way.
Yeah, and then I can also see in some of your performances, your ancestral stories are also having a place. So what cultural or ancestral lineage informs your movement?
Hmm. Um, so I have two separate lineages that I know about. So on my dad's side, my grandfather was born in historic Armenia, which is now Turkey. And that family, so Cilicia, right,
Yeah,
indigenously from Cilicia. Um, then that family was part of the diaspora after the Armenian genocide, and then he settled in Beirut. Um, and so my family became part of that very strong core of Armenians in Beirut that is now I mean, I know a lot of folks with that same trajectory where then their families move to somewhere in Canada or the US or Europe after
Yeah.
that. So so in that sense, I identify as both ethnically Armenian on that side as well as first generation Lebanese. And the channeling of that for me is one that has been full of complexity and nuance and sometimes alienation and sometimes liminality because there are so many levels of distance, but I also while there is like a lament and a sorrow in that, there's also what I have chosen to approach as a power in terms of what it means to be a member of a diaspora, and a diaspora that's powerful and that we have so many experiences that we can carry and share that are I feel like now, especially in this particular moment in the art world, people are getting it a little bit more. But I think generally globally, like there's a lot of knowledge there in the ways that we've survived and thrived. And on my mother's side, I'm some blend of white European that I don't know that much about. My mom was
Hmm.
adopted in 1950 when she was born, and so it wasn't really a time where open adoptions were very prevalent here, and it
Yeah.
wasn't something that she chose to pursue too much of. I think she eventually did do an ancestry test, but she's a lot more estranged from more of her family here. So, in terms of the way that I bring that into the work, I have done some ancestral research and talked more about the ways in which the German side of her adopted family were essentially cultural refugees who came to this country but then betrayed the indigenous people here. So I have a work that explores that in conjunction with Armenian indigeneity, right? So it's complicated. It's complicated, right? Because I have all of these things going on at the same time. And for me, holding that multiplicity is very important, even if there are gaps in knowledge. And I'm not necessarily, not all of my work has to do with like a clear, like, history of everything that has happened, right? It's more about the scraps and the things that I've gleaned over time. So the work where I brought in my mom's side, it had to do with all this research that her relatives had done and the narratives and the language they used to describe themselves and their plight and the things that they went through, and then questioning that, right, vis-a-vis white privilege, which I know I have. And so it's the balance of holding those things has been it's difficult, but for me, it's really fertile ground to especially as a mover, right? Because our bodies can hold so much complexity and nuance and subtlety. And I get chills thinking about that because there's something beyond what we could write down or what we could simply say. And so again, for me, that always goes back to like, what is it that I hold, right? What is it that I hold physically and somatically that like comes through as a result of being in these lineages the way that I am, even if I am distanced from certain things.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting for me to ask this question. I can confess that because in another context, we might have born in the same country.
I know, right?
This was really interesting. And then while you're describing the historical cities here is south of Turkey, and I know there, and also I'm aware of the people who really escaped from the genocide to Lebanon and then established their Armenian cultural life and identity there again. So it's, as you said, it is so complex. And then at the same time, with your mother's side history, I can hear that many stories and the history is overlapping onto each other, and there are some empty spaces in between that we are understanding and we're trying to feel, and our bodies are also speaking. They are still sensing that spaces, spoken things and unspoken things all together. And I think also performing that is one of the best ways to really share this with people, but also regulate yourself as well.
Yes, absolutely. No, and I that's a really poetic way you're saying we sense through those spaces, right? And that like for me, the spaces and the gaps are part of the heritage actually. And so it's not that it's nothing and it's a loss, right? Like especially as Armenians, right? I feel like so much of our history is like it's put in this place of like just sadness and loss, and it's like, well, what about all the things that we've been through and the ways that we're still here, and like the ways that we're here differently than our ancestors were, and what are the connections as well? So I appreciate you bringing that up because yeah, I think we can wax poetic about liminality, but then living in it is difficult and challenging terrain, but it for me it's something to work with, you know.
Definitely. I think for many of us who are experiencing similar historic difficulties, it is something to work with. And seems like the population who has to work within the global community sadly rising. But as you also marked, which I am also feeling too, these stories are containing lots of resilience and power, which is the positive side, the light side of the story that together we are here and we find each other and many other people will able to listen us, which is I think a little bit of bliss and celebration at the same time.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, let's open this context a bit more and then widen to this question: how have colonialism, migration, or displacement shaped your dance story?
Um, yeah, if I think about that in terms of like my own history as a mover, so much of the dance that I do is from a Western context, but the way that I move, for me is really connected again to all these histories we were talking through. Um, the what became important for me eventually was to find a way to tell intergenerational stories through my body, and find a way to do that, even though my lineage or heritage through the dances that I have learned is really just from a Western context, whether it's the studio dances I did growing up,
Yeah.
or I was on a competitive dance team in high school, or the postmodern dance I was doing in college and in my adulthood, or I also teach dance, or I was teaching dance very regularly in public schools here in the US. And so a big part of that teaching, actually, though, I think it's important to note is that, I was working across public schools in New York and Chicago. And initially, that was a way to um, be able to move to, make my living and work with kids, which I loved. And I realized it mattered to me most though because I went to public schools here where there is mostly some music and some art education, but not much dance or theater when you're in those school years of like 5 to 18 years old, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, if someone like me showed up and had showed up in my public school when I was like in 9 years old, I would have thought it was the craziest thing. And of course, that's looking back, right? But at the same time, I knew that a lot of these kids uh, weren't going to get exposed to what their bodies could show them otherwise. And a lot of these kids are living in various diasporas of their own, right? So
Hmm.
in terms of going back to your initial question of like colonization and migration, like so many of these children were experiencing this in a much closer way than I did, I would say, in terms of having migrated from very dangerous situations to settle in these large cities. And now, of course, these kids are having to deal with this in a very head-on way with the terrorization of ICE in our communities, right? Which
Yeah.
I haven't been teaching in public schools this last year or two. But so for me, it became a way to show up in these schools and say, hey, I'm actually part of a diaspora too. I know it might not look like it, right? what are the dances that you do at home? What is the music that you listen to at home? Let's bring that in, right? And not in a way where I was appropriating it, but rather level the playing field between student and teacher a bit, and then find a way to facilitate and steward an experience where students could feel seen and feel empowered.
Yeah.
Um, and we could also have that connection. It's funny because when you first asked this question, I wasn't thinking in that direction, but teaching has been a hugely important part of my sort of oeuvre as a dancer. And that also came into how I taught my more peer-to-peer workshops because I wanted to get people into their bodies in a way that was an expanded idea of dance. So the sort of like dance and voice and performance art style workshops. And I was doing it with my peers across different disciplines. So this wasn't in the schools, this was with folks, with adults primarily. And but it had sort of a similar thing of like, how can I empower what's already here to come to the surface?
I also watched some of your workshops where you were conducting with adults, and I also find them very brave and nice in terms of they weren't only body works, but they were like at the same time activist practices. You were opening space people to become activists of their lives, whatever their story, whatever the voice they need to rise or realize and hear each other. I think it's so valuable these days to have that where mainly the mainstream dance workshop idea is like move, 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 move as much as possible, or whether it need to be somatic and you have to always lie down on the space, on the ground. But no, there are many different varieties, and that's why I also like one of your other poetry performances where you were warning people to say, like, look, in this performance, you will be hearing things about racism, sexism, homophobia, and institutional racism, which I find it also very wise to underline these things. And this was how your performance were also shaping around these things. So, I want to go to the next question. What does your body carries that history books do not?
Yes. I really love this question. So my immediate response when I read that question was complexity. Complexity. I
Yeah,
think, you know, and that is not to knock the discipline of history. Historians are doing wonderful work to crack open the complexity of histories like mine, and beyond. But for me, one of the things I've always tried to encompass in the work that I do is the complexity of these micro experiences, I would say, that really define who we are in real time. Um, so I grew up in a small town in Texas, and most people I meet within art context have no idea what that was like. They have lots of projections onto it, you know, and they have lots of assumptions. And when I chose to move back to my home state, so many people who have never even been here had so many things to say to me, you know, about what they thought and whether or not they would visit me and why would I do that and I should do this when I get there and all this kind of thing.
yeah,
And so that for me, because I realized, you know, so many people were like growing up working class in rural Texas was very foreign to many people in my midst. That was actually where that I started to crack that complexity open in my own practice and then connect it to these histories of forced migration and diaspora and genocide and war in a way that, you know, for a long time I think I struggled with figuring out how to weave those things together because they seem so disparate, right? But they're all woven together in the tapestry of who I am, so to speak.
yes,
And that kind of complexity for me really comes down to specific memories, specific things people said, right? And these things that kind of like hook in, right, to my mind. And I'm still working with that right now to some degree, in ways that I continue to find a real range of responses to, and as I mature as an artist, I'm able to sharpen the pencil of that, so to speak, right? Sharpen that skill, that ability to not make it so complex that people don't get it, right? Like deal with some of the ambiguity and the nuance, but still tell the stories. Um, but yeah, I think more than anything, that complexity is the reason why that I make the kind of work that I do. And that I want to continue to challenge myself to make other kinds of work as well, which is like such a wonderful thing about being an artist that we can do it our whole lives, right? We can
Yeah.
find ways to do it our whole lives, and it's not this thing that has to be held away from us because of age or ability or class or whatever else. So yeah, I find that to be a really fertile and fruitful space to live in that space of complexity that can't really, for me, I don't even try to contain it by my practice. I try to even expand it by my practice to be like, oh, maybe this is even more complicated than I think it is. And like, what are ways to continue to put that forward in a way that can resonate with people more and can affirm our humanity in new ways.
Yeah, I can see in your performances you are definitely going beyond dance to other disciplines and widening your space in terms of reflecting, playing, and interpreting with these different complexities. And if we come back to dance, in what ways does your dance resist forgetting?
Yes, this question I also loved, and my simple answer. I always like to come up with my gut answer because I know I'll say like 2,000 words otherwise. But
Okay.
my simple answer is it keeps going. It keeps going, because even and if I think about it in a literal way, right? Like over the course of the last 10 years, I've experienced a lot of physical changes that even people who know me, I don't think would necessarily know about. But I've had to change the way that I engage in the world physically because of new joint issues and nerve issues and just things that are part of aging, but also part of like really really pushing my body a lot in a lot of different kinds of spaces for a long time. And but I guess the medical establishment would call it lifestyle changes. There's certainly some of that happening, but I decided, I'm not going to lose my ability to move. I'm just going to adapt, right? And I think that adaptability could be a different answer to this question, right? Resisting
Yeah,
forgetting by adapting, right? And there are certain things culturally you could say that I'm less open to adapting to, not really interested in adapting to AI. That's a whole conversation we could have. But but like what are the ways to adapt in terms of like um again, like deepening and broadening the resonance of the work, right? And I mean that both the resonance in the physical sense, right? The way it hits, like here,
yeah.
and here, and also broadening, because a big question, important question for me has always been who is the work for? And I want the work to be for as many people as possible. And of course, there are obvious limitations. I
Of
am
course.
working in English primarily. Like this is an issue, but when I've worked in other places where that isn't the primary language, it's like, okay, so how do I adapt, right? How do I keep this word as fresh and accessible as possible? Um, and also to just keep moving. Like right now, again, going back to like my life, I'm not teaching dance right now. I intentionally chose to take a break from it. Um, but I'm working a lot with my hands. I'm gaining new skills.
Hmm.
I'm doing woodworking. I'm doing some art restoration. I'm doing some landscaping. I'm working with the land. Like there are so many different ways to use your body, right? And then
Of
to
course. Of
different
course.
kinds of connectivity and different skills also. And I've always felt so inspired by folks who age and decide to do that, right? And then it keeps the mind sharp, and the mind is part of the body, right? So it's a really it's definitely a challenge. But again, it's one that I would rather meet than lament that we have, if that makes sense. Like just like the challenge of all these different cultural layers.
Definitely, and our bodies, this connectivity and creativity through hands are also very enriching for the brain. And our practices, when we come back again to teaching or performing again, which is not always possible in each artist's life to endure this all the time. So sometimes breaks are very refreshing too.
Yes.
And during your life, your practice in the dance field, did you ever felt othered, and how this shaped your expression?
All the time. All the time. I mean, so I think one thing I should say, especially as someone who was previously an anthropology student and is vehemently anti-racist, is that I will never, my level of othering will always be tempered by my whiteness as well, right? Because this is what I hold. And so just to start there and hold myself accountable to that, and also to say, yes, on many levels, quite a lot. I think particularly within dance, I didn't get really intense technical training growing up. So once I got into other spaces, in college and beyond, I realized that there was kind of some unspoken rules around having like really good ballet training, for example.
Yes,
Um, and I I've always been very performative in a way that sometimes did not feel entirely welcome in the dance world. When I make my work, people often ask if it's devised theater or if it's clowning or if I've, studied with these different theater companies, and I actually haven't. But similarly, going back to the lineage comment earlier, I do feel in the lineage of that. I feel indebted to that work, right? And
yeah,
so um, people, if I think of the work of like Holly Hughes or Fiona Templeton, who are in the theater realm, I feel in their lineage as well. Um, so yes, definitely that. And then also, as mentioned, the class differences. It's interesting. I recently heard someone say that Armenians were a wealthy diaspora, and I was like,
oh,
oh, yeah, I guess the Kardashians. And then I was like, oh, yeah, and some of my family that we don't talk to anymore. And oh, because I never experienced that. I mean, I grew up very working class. I still identify as such. My family still moves through the world in that way, and I'm very connected to them. And again, this has to be tempered by my proximity I've had to wealth, proximity I've had to institutions, elitism, all of these things, but also having to navigate that as someone who doesn't have that mentality, we'll say. And like truly, I find I have so much to learn from my working class lineage, I would say, that I'm always returning to in terms of resourcefulness and adaptability, as mentioned before, right? But that can be a big shift too. And the interesting thing is that particularly in arts and university spaces, often people are able to get into them because of things like funding being available, right? It's this weird contradictory thing. So then I find my people, but really the other way that I found my people was by expanding into other genres. So working in experimental music and noise, working in performance art, where often, folks I've collaborated with have more visual backgrounds,
yeah,
or theater or sound backgrounds or dance as well. But, we're trying to approach our whatever training we came in with initially in a more expanded view. Um, and so I've found my people in broad strokes that way, both living in New York, Chicago, and Austin, where I live now. And so yeah, I've definitely experienced that, and now I've begun to embrace it. Just to say, actually, I'm all of these things, and not to. not to try not to have imposter syndrome about it, honestly, like to say, I belong here as much as anyone else. And that also means that I have a responsibility to bring in others who might feel that way more than I do. And to again alchemize that feeling of maybe self-pity or not belonging into a greater collective responsibility, I think is something that we as artists are uniquely positioned socially to do.
Yeah.
Um, and so I try to remember that, and it can be very hard to, this is all artists should have good therapists because it can be very hard.
Yeah, many of us who ask these questions, I think we all encounter with this reality of we need a therapist. Yeah, definitely. And in between these inner and outer dynamics, which are very vivid and also, how to say, vibrant as well. Um, what does it mean for you to be visible? What is visibility for you?
Yes, that question I saw, and I was like, oh, I was like, wow, she's good with the simple, profound questions. Um, so this is an intense quote to begin on, and I'll be honest and say I'm not sure exactly who originated this, but I attribute it to trans women and trans women of color in particular. Visibility is and can be a trap, right? Visibility can
Yeah.
be a trap, right? It can mean that we are funneling our images into um, corporate platforms that think of corporations more as people and then benefit off of our life force or our images, right? For example, or it can mean that we get a certain amount of notoriety and maybe actual material support for a moment while we're trendy, while we're important, and then we get forgotten about
Yeah.
again, right? And this is why ultimately connectivity feels more important to me than visibility.
Mm,
So Grace Lee Boggs, the wonderful activist, right? She says that it's not about critical mass, it's about critical connections. I have a poster on my wall right next to the Armenian alphabet, by the way.
oh, I
We'll have
should
to
be
talk.
dancing somewhere there. Yeah, okay.
Yes, right. Where she says that, and it's so important. My nephew was looking at it the other day. He's like 8 years old, and I was like, "Are you reading that?" And he was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "I'm just gonna let him sit with that because he might not get it yet." But ultimately, to me, what it means is that each of our individual relationships build, right, what we call in anti-racist worlds, the net that works, right? Not the network in terms of like however many people follow you on this or that platform, but the net
Yeah,
that works, the people who have got you. And not only have got you in the sense of like if you're in a big pickle and you need help, but also they understand you, like they see you.
yeah,
And I'll use another sort of linguistic device here and say there's a difference between getting resources and being well resourced, right? Right? Like
yes,
feeling that
yes,
nourishment. And for me, that's always been about community. And um, hopefully my what I'll say are my siblings from a group that we have called Live and Active Cultures, which is people of broad Anatolian descent who are all in diaspora here in the States. We in many ways we function as mostly a text group, but we know that
yeah,
we understand each other, right? So like when things are happening and I mean, we know what's happening in Iran and in Lebanon right now. Just
yes, yes,
there,
in the
right? But like
Middle East.
because there's many of us have connections to other global cultures, there's lots of things happening a lot of the time, and we can always just say, "Hey, I'm just going to leave a voice message here and like let these feelings be heard about what I'm feeling while I'm watching the news today." Right? And that those little things again, I think really matter, right? Those going back to kind of what I was saying earlier when we talk about our experience, it's all these micro moments that up to add up to a life, right? And and the lives that we really share with each other. So I think one of the issues with visibility is that it can kind of be boxed in this way as like, okay, here's this two-dimensional version of you versus the
Yes,
crazy swirl of things that you are. I used to refer to it as like a maelstrom, right? It's like, and that's what a life really is. So I think that's kind of an issue with it. At the same time, right? I do not I do not resent visibility when people are doing it on their own terms and really being able to be seen in the ways that they want to be seen. And
Yeah.
a lot of Armenian artists across the diaspora, particularly a lot of the film and performance work by Kemi Abrahamian, really wonderful filmmaker and writer, performer, uh, is so dedicated to put it like making our culture, particularly as queer Armenians, visible and doing the depth work as well, right? Not doing it in a surface way. I think the issue sometimes with visibility is that they just want to scrape off the top of the surface, right? And not see all of that complexity. And so yeah, that is my that's my answer to that.
Like, and can you tell me that thing which is written on your wall again? Can we repeat that again?
Yes, so I'm going to paraphrase it if that's
Yes.
okay. Like it won't be
Yes,
an exact
please.
quote.
Yeah.
So Grace Lee Boggs said that we're often concerned with critical mass, wherein this world in which we're so exquisitely connected, what's
Yeah.
truly important are critical connections. And that we never know that in the fabric of our connectedness, the ways we can make an impact or a difference in each other's lives because of those critical connections.
Yeah, definitely. I just want you to repeat because I would like to be sure if I'm remembering right. Because in some cultures, when you are critical, some connections are disappearing. So I think it's so important to be informed what is criticality as well and how it can take us beyond, how it can develop us, how it can help us to see otherwise situations, thoughts, and feelings, and everything. So, by itself, criticality is a kind of a culture, and if you bring with connectivity, I think it is very flourishing and enriching culture. So, our next question is: how does the land shaped your dance and movement?
hmm Um, I'm gonna kind of tie in one of your earlier questions about the earliest memories of movement. Um, for me, earliest memories of land feel connected to that. So I grew up a little north of where I live now, and I grew up on the plains, and this is not my indigenous land by any means. But I was born there, and I grew up in a little house where uh we didn't even have like a fence in the backyard. It just went into these meadows, these
Yeah,
plains, and it was on this little dirt road where we could ride our bikes down to a creek, and the sky was just so huge. It's like a very flat place. And I have these deep memories. Like my parents grew roses and grew mint that they would make the tea with and put in the hummus and all this, right? And put in the lemonade that wasn't really lemonade because we couldn't actually get that from the store. And I just remember being able to feel such solace on that land. And And as I've learned, right, and grown so much in terms of understanding that you can feel connected with a place in many different ways, I've learned to honor and learn more about the indigenous ways of knowing of the places that I've lived or that I'm from, or the indigenous people that I know my ancestors interacted with. Um, and I also, as an artist, a lot of my work has become really site specific and sometimes not site specific in the most obvious way. Um, when I performed in Tulsa, I was really struck by the fact that um, streets that were formerly named after Ku Klux Klan members had been rebranded to be named after Black activists, right? And so, what exactly, right? What does this mean? And this is within an area of the country where you drive past, oh, this is Choctaw Nation. Oh, now you're out of Choctaw Nation, like, and that's what you get, right? It's over there. So we put them over there, right? This kind of thing of like containment once again, right? Going back to the visibility issue. And so I made work about that, but in a way that wasn't necessarily like that wasn't necessarily exactly what you felt, right? But where was the arts district? It was in this area where they had rebranded. So what does that mean about how art is being utilized in these processes that are very problematic?
Yeah.
Um, but then sometimes it really is about specifically the place. When I was in Chattanooga, um, Tennessee, at our residency called Stoveworks, there was a housing development that went up in a matter of 6 weeks. And it's luxury housing that's like built very quickly with all of these amenities. And it was in an industrial zone next to the artist residency and next to the like military cemetery. And so I was just like, whoa, we've got to make, I made a film, I made a dance and sort of noise piece about it. And so, yeah, I've come to know that I need to respond to place a lot of the time. Um, and and for me, that also means having some kind of relationship with place that I'm in that again, even if there are various layers of alienation, brings my body into presence. And yeah, now the place where my family lives now, I know it like the back of my hand. There are trees that are like that tree is my conduit, my ancestral conduit to my grandfather, and that one's the one to my, and like
Yeah.
having like prayer and conversation and ritual and just simply walking, like all of these things have become really important more recently. So that's been part of a spiritual practice that's really motivated and lent a great degree of acceleration to my work, particularly within intergenerational storytelling. Um, so yeah, there's just so many layers to that question. It's hard for me to give just one answer because it hits on multiple registers for me in
Yeah.
my social, spiritual, and artistic practices.
Yeah, in the different parts of your life from different faces, different places and effects. Thanks for sharing this rich perspective with me. And then how your body's relationship with more than human world as a dancer.
Yeah, yeah. So I was mentioning my relationship with the trees where my family lives. It's very, very key. When they first moved down here and I visited, I was like, whoa. Like, I have to talk to these trees. Like I literally named a small grove the council. And I would
Yeah.
go and like present my questions, and they would respond, right? And so for me, trees in particular, and I chose the name lichen in a very sort of simple, childlike way on one hand, because lichen loves trees,
Yeah.
and it grows on trees, right? But also this relationship with something, an entity that is multiple, that is symbiotic to itself and the things around it, that tells histories, right? So, I have to find this, but I know there was an artist or historian who was looking at the way in which studying the lichen in Artsakh, right,
Hmm.
was a way of understanding history there, right? So this is a living creature that keeps score, right? That tells us what has happened
Definitely.
and
Yeah, yeah.
can also contribute to a healthier planet. It's known for cleaning the air, things like that. And so that's not, that's not something that's a metaphor to me by any means. And then there's again like the way in which, as just mentioned, right, the natural world for me is a conduit for the spiritual world. Um, but also I believe that spirit moves through the way that the epiphanies in the work happen. When something becomes clear that it's like, oh shit, that's what I'm doing. That's it,
Yeah.
you know, or like that's what needs to be said, or that's how that thing needs to be said, or it's like boom, 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 these three disparate points actually connect, right? And a lot of that for me happens through improvisation. A
Yes.
lot of it, something that Tatiana Tenenbaum has really encouraged me in is like lying fallow, which is a thing the land needs to do as well. The land needs to rest, the land needs to burn, the land needs to regenerate. And so there's a great connectivity in all of this. And I think that. Yeah, that it's a super developing thing for me to like stay connected to land and spirit and see what's there. And it's funny because right now I'm in a very active place in my artistic practice,
Hmm.
and I really want I want this summer to be a place where there's more like just listening, because it's only because of that listening that we have those epiphanies that are connected to ancestors, to spirit, to again what you're saying, the more than human world. Yeah.
Yeah, when you mentioned about your name and your love to trees and this lichen, it also reminds me it's a plant in between like animal and plant, which is also quite adaptive, getting different shapes, getting different positions and situations, and always keeps surviving. It's so beautiful. As much as, of course, the air quality is fine, and they're also part of the resilience stories, I guess so.
Yes, and they're also, just to add one thing, I found out they're known as extremophiles. So areas where other things won't grow. We're talking volcanoes. Like they'll grow there because they have this extreme adaptability. And I have at times been known for getting myself into situations and things, right, that are not the easiest. But for me, there's an ancestral exhortation there, right? There's my grandfather saying, like, well, we got through it when they were occupying our land, and this is how we did it. And my dad, same thing. I got through it when I had to leave my home country because of war, right? Because my dad
Yeah,
came here just before the Lebanese Civil War started, right? So it's
yeah,
like, how do we navigate? And you saw how I moved just now. Like, this is not a metaphor, right? Like, when I really like move through those things, there is this like strange, like shape-shifting thing that happens in my body that I know it's more than just me. And I do think I know that I'm a conduit for things beyond me, and that there's a larger life purpose in the things that I've felt compelled to share.
yeah. And then I want to bring to this question, how do you share your practice with others?
Yes. So I got into this a little earlier with the workshops, right?
Yes,
What I started to feel, particularly participating in the dance world, is, as mentioned, that there were unspoken understandings around how you were supposed to behave in dance spaces based on training and class, which of course those two things are quite connected, right? People's
yeah,
access to certain kinds of training can often be based on class, right? And I mean, I was scholarshiped into almost every training opportunity I got, right? Um, and so I had to kind of learn that as I got older and realize like, oh, there are, what in the anthropology world they would call kind of a semiotics of
mm,
how you're supposed to dress, how you're supposed to speak, the volume you're supposed to speak at, how you're supposed to move. And I realized that in some of these contexts, like they actually wanted my movement to look a certain way, but they wouldn't say that, right? It was
yes,
like improvise and do this, 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 and this. And I'm like, well, what if I throw myself against the wall right now? What if I did something that was like really intense? Or like, what if I do something that's really small, right?
yeah,
Really small. And like when it's supposed to be some big thing. And I think, to be fair, there's all sorts of like projection and understanding and misunderstanding on my own side because I'm a human being. But but there's still, I knew those things were going on. So probably, let's see, like 14 years ago, I started just doing peer-to-peer workshops. I would just email people and say, I've rented this space. I'm trying to develop kind of a pedagogy around this.
Hmm.
I was teaching in the public schools already, but those are very restrictive in their own way, right?
Of course, yeah.
If I could get the kids laying on the floor, I would, but sometimes we were dancing where their desks were, right? Or laying on the floor meant that they were going to kick each other in the head. Sometimes just because
No.
of space concerns, right? Um, so I had to find ways to kind of regiment the somatic like regulation I was trying to help them with. Um, and more than anything, I wanted to start to develop something that could take the processes I was working on in smaller groups of 2 to 3 people with my collaborators for performance into something larger and see like, okay, how is a musician going to interpret this? Right? How is a visual artist going to interpret this? And the last workshop I taught was in Regina, Saskatchewan, in Canada,
Hmm.
um, through the Performatorium Festival there, which is really wonderful. And I was really so satisfied with seeing the difference in responses because the way that I teach, I tell people, this doesn't have to look a certain way. You don't have to do everything I ask you to do, actually. You can
Definitely.
rebel. I think rebellion is interesting, and rebellion doesn't have to look like a certain thing, right? If we're
Yes.
doing something and you want to stay in it, and I give another directive, then you stay in it. If you decide you need to just destimulate and go lie down, that's fine. And as I've learned more and more from the disability justice worlds as well, right? Like giving those options is such a huge deal. And there's still so much I have to learn, right? There's so much I have to learn. But understanding that as an access tool, I think has been particularly important for me. And it's so delightful when I get to see a group of people all getting the same instructions and doing whatever the fuck they want. you know, and not in a way that feels not intentional, right? Because I have my intention and I care so much about facilitation and stewardship, right?
Yes.
The same way I care about my audience's experiences, but I don't expect them all to have the same experience. And if
Of
something lands in a way that I don't expect, right? It's impact over intention, right? It's like, okay, well, that's how that landed. So what am I going to do about that now? Right? Because I have a responsibility to my audiences the same way I do to my peers who are often, my students in these cases. So yeah, that's for me the way that I'm able to like share my practice. And I find pedagogy extremely interesting. I also worked with a social practice collective that we called Undoing and Doing.
Oh, that's
Um,
perfect. Yeah, I saw that. I love that too. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And so much of that, there were people in the collective who were like, I'm not interested in pedagogy. And I was like, that's fine. You don't have to think about it that way, actually. Like we're creating experiences for ourselves and others to share, to think about critical questions about the world and our art practice. So let's do that. And that can look like a zine that turns out to be really interesting, actually. Like, because we're not, you know what I mean? Like just to put
Yeah.
people in the room and see what happens. And I think more and more that's extremely important. And going back to the critical um, connections over critical mass, right? It's like I know that the masses are more interested in internet influencers. Like I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
I've never really cared how many people know about what I'm doing, right? Like I care about who knows about what I'm doing, and I don't always know who it is, right? Um, it's not like I know every person I work with or, remember or whatever, every person I teach or perform in front of, but I think that I'm going to misquote this, but that quote that's like a small group of people do like working on any given thing can change the world. Maybe I'll find this quote for you later. But that there's power in that intentionality and presence that has less to do with hundreds to thousands to millions of people knowing what you're doing necessarily.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm totally agree with you. The richness of when you say something, everybody does something different. It is one of the most blessing moments of teaching, which also kept me teaching in many years in public schools in Turkey and also private schools and associations. That's one of the reasons why I always stay with creative dance and nearly never taught any technical class because things were opening up and changing, and there was encouragement, empowerment, and creativity was going on, which was one of the best things, especially for more, how to say, traditional communities, because we need the other sides of expressions. And in your case, to have this community together to communicate, collaborate, hear each other's thoughts or the topics, although it doesn't really interest us, still be together. I think one of the pillars of the peace culture at the same time. Yeah, with these
Absolutely.
mass connections, people are hardly coming together from the opposite ideas, you know. That is the one thing that the mass communication is actually dividing people.
It's flattening things a lot. It's
Yeah.
flattening things. And I think people are trying to combat that. I mean, I have to say that when I open up Instagram or whatever, it's, I've curated it to my interests. So there are people thinking about, the complexities of it. But yeah, I think it's a hard cultural moment with people being chronically online, we'll say, and being over concerned with the visibility of that, right? I mean, literal visibility, right? Like, which again, I want people to think about what they felt, right? From whatever it is that I do, not what it looks like. And I think there's a lot of the art world that is not aware of how obsessed we are with what things look like. What they
Yes.
seem versus what they are is what I'll say.
Oh, yeah, that can be a huge difference sometimes.
Yes,
Again, in connection to all of these things, what would you like younger generations to remember or reimagine?
that's such a beautiful question. The word exuberance came to me. I make work that can sometimes be very, very serious.
Yes.
There's always humor in it though. Always, always, always. And I really I had just had this vision. It's an auditory memory as well of my dad and my uncle just doing this like loud old Armenian guy cackle. I like when they're together, it's like ha 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 ha. There's this goofiness that I think is in a way a critical goofiness about what I
Yeah.
do, where it's always been really important to my presence as a teacher in particular, because it's kind of like being like, "Psst, don't take it all so seriously, and like we built this without us, like that wouldn't be able to exist, and so then because of that, we are positioned to challenge things through that kind of thinking outside the box because we live outside of those boxes. And um and so, yeah, I think, for when I think about all the students I've taught, or when I think about my audiences, I almost want to say critical exuberance, right? Like
Yeah.
this, going back to this criticality, right? Which I hear you. I mean, I've also alienated audiences with that criticality sometimes, right? And at the same time, I know that when people are able to, when it lands well, right? That there's something important about the trickster energy. So Bayo Okomalefe, right, has been talking about
Yes.
this a lot, right? And I love the way he talks about it. I love it so much because I'm like, yes, and I don't think I'll ever lose that because the work I keep referring to intergenerational storytelling, truly, like the ways in which my family has gotten by over the course of generations, like it does make me laugh. I mean, there are so many funny, weird stories that are like, whoa, and that's how that visit to the immigration office went. What the
Yeah.
hell? You know? But it's not these like heroic, vaulted, redemptive narratives, right? It's the reality of these things that make us who we are and that I have a great deal of pride in, and that I think I was channeling long before I knew it. And because of that, I've dealt with a lot of feelings of pain or shame or being misunderstood, but moving through all of those things is extremely important. And for me, important to have these communities that can really span what's considered high or low art, right? What's considered, you know what I mean? Like what's
I know, definitely, I know. And what does it mean to dance as an act of resistance for you?
yeah. Um, I feel like I've heard the phrase, man, this is the challenge of an interview and thinking in the moment because I want to quote things and then I forget where I've learned them. But I'm pretty sure I saw a music project at one point that was called While We Still Have Bodies. And the challenges you're talking about, right, with these technological changes, right, which can be really exciting, and I don't want to purely resist those, but it's important again to be, thoughtful and critical about them. Um, my body is a harbinger of so much experience and understanding. My body is an interlocutor with the more than human world. My body is my home. My body is my signal. My body tells me where I am and what makes sense, right? When you feel like a real connection with a person, you feel it
Yeah.
in your body, right? You feel it in your body. And when we feel that moment as artists of like, this is it, this is what I need to be doing. And sometimes it's like, this is it, right? And sometimes you have to hear that whisper like 20 times before you're like, oh, you know? And it's one of for me, the great pleasures and privileges of being a mover. Because even if sometimes I'm not dancing, right? It's like
Yeah.
the the movement is still there and it's like I'm able to crack myself open and like work with what's inside. And to me, that is resisting certain tides of cultural shifts or stagnation or constriction that need to be resisted right now. And people are putting their bodies in the streets, right? People's
Yeah.
bodies in this are in the streets, and a lot of people, who might watch this might not know that's happening in Texas too. A lot of it, and sometimes it's smaller communities, sometimes it's bigger communities. Um, we have a community of activists that's being incredibly suppressed right now called the Prairie Land Defendants. I highly recommend people look them up. Um, they're being told that protesting is not allowed anymore, basically, being made an example of, held in prison, and they are they put their bodies on the line, right? And so for me, if my body is on a stage and I'm asking people to be in the experience of witnessing, right? Whatever I'm doing physically, I want to take some kind of real risk. I want to
Yes.
say, what is it that we're really doing with this, right? And that will always, to me, be an act of resistance against the powers that would have me not be trans, not be queer, not recognize my diaspora lineage, not recognize my white privilege, not recognize my ability privilege, not recognize my aging body. Like all of these things are actually rich terrain for so much. And that's how I live in my body. So
Yeah, and what you're reclaiming to through your dance, which you start to already give the answers with the previous question, but what is really reclaiming through your dance?
beautiful. Yeah. I was just talking to someone I'm working with about my work as an act of cultural reclamation. And they said, "Oh, I've never heard that phrase before, cultural reclamation." And I said, "Oh, I don't think I mean, I definitely didn't originate that term, but to me, it just fits so well with my understanding again of looking at, on some level, lamenting the alienation that forced migration and violence have caused, but also looking at the fragments and like finding the juicy bits, right? And like working with that. Gloria Anzaldúa talks about this a lot, really wonderful Latina feminist theorist, right? That like we find ourselves in those fragments. And it's not that those fragments have to fit together perfectly like puzzle pieces. The
Yeah,
way that they don't, they don't fit, right? Going back to what you were talking about these spaces and these gaps, like
definitely.
that's something beautiful that we have to move through. And so and for me, finding that has as much to do with, talking about the weirdness of growing up in a small town in Texas and also how important that was to me, and like how that shaped me um and also all of these. I mean, I feel like I have so many stories to tell, and that just excites me for when I get older and, touch wood, stay healthy and can still find ways to tell them, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And maybe and as I get sick and as I whatever, I mean, like I don't just mean healthy in that sense of like I actually you can scratch that from the record. As I get older and go through whatever changes I go through and continue to be nimble and find those adaptive ways to tell those stories. Because there's just so much that lives in them that like just briefly another thing that comes up too is like the art of living, like so many of the arts of living that my forebears have shown me. That when it's not just the art of the stories themselves, but what they were doing in those stories, that like there are very few people in my lineage who would consider themselves artisans yet, right? We're
yeah,
the
yeah.
Armenian jewelers. My family is a lot of Armenian jewelers. Um,
Uh-huh.
but like, even thinking about that metaphorically speaking, right? The specificity of having to get to do that work, that kind of intricate work, and the specificity of moving through a checkpoint, right? Like there's
Yeah,
this specificity and this adaptability and this skill being able to negotiate and navigate that I delight in that. I delight in that and I also have sort of the cultural position of being able to, right? Of saying there's so many things that my forebears fought for to get me here and the access that I have, let me use that. Let me use that and yeah, so that's how that reclaiming fits into the sort of the schema of my life and my work.
yeah. I think where you touch is so juicy because while you were also referencing to this Latin feminist, which
Yeah.
everything is not really uh, covering or really, how to say, connecting to each other. But I think that's so normal because things are so much fragmented, and then we are trying to find the different pieces of puzzles, and then sometimes the pieces are coming from a surprising places, and then surprisingly they are fitting to unexpected places. So we are maybe rewriting our history. Uh, with human history altogether. So, this is collective writing. So, some are having a different way of writing, and this is you described your artist way of rewriting the story and also your artist practice through your artist practice, which is very rich and multi-layered as well. Thanks for sharing. It's a lot, I
Absolutely.
think, people who listen this podcast, including me, who is the host, we need to a little bit digest this, stay a few days with this podcast for a while in our minds, hearts, and bodies. So, eventually, we come to the last question. If you could design a world where your dance was fully seen and valued, what would your dance choreography look like?
See, this was another one where I had like kind of an immediate answer. I was like, "Whoa, cool question." Um, this is kind of it's a funny answer, but I was immediately like much smaller. Like not smaller in terms of like there's so much subtle movement that we're doing all the time that I find insanely interesting, right? But it's hard to make that translate for the stage or translate for film or whatever it is you're doing with dance. And One of my lineages is in the contact improvisation world. So like going back to things like Steve Paxton's small dance, right? That's always
Yes.
happening. Like that, but yeah, so it's something like that, but also something beyond that when I really am able to be in a studio and let myself do what I want, there's something in these things that can seem quite small that are actually really profound. And, it's like if you're looking at a cave from above ground, you don't even know that it's there, right?
Yeah.
There's this like
Yeah.
whole world, right, within our bodies. And I have to say that like so much of the dance that I've loved that I've gotten to do with choreographers like Kathy Westwater, Jill Sigmund, Daria Fine, Lindsay Drury, Yvonne Meyer. These are some of my of the matriarchs in my dance life.
Yeah.
Um, Melinda Ring. There in each of those processes, right? There was so much dance that was like going on this crazy pathway to find the dance, if that makes sense, right? Going on this pathway of like these ways of prompting and these ways of guiding, and again, that facilitation which and stewardship, which is really a form of care, right?
Yeah.
That enabled me to expand into ways of moving that I didn't think were possible. And that even, as a young dancer, I thought were wrong, right? Again, because of these exhortations to have a trained
Of
body,
course. Of
and to
course.
have a don't have a don't yeah, having certain like aesthetic markers be shown to me as like what's important. So much of like what I think of in terms of that expanded movement really comes from working with those artists, and that I still try to channel in the work I make myself. But yeah, I love the question, honestly, because it just makes me think about this, like what feels impossible. I would say, like the other short answer for me is like dances that don't feel possible in this world could be possible, right? And I think that's actually true anyway. That like there's so much movement that we don't think of that way, and it's one of the reasons I work. Um, a lot of people, interdisciplinary is a very hot word.
Yes.
I like to say transdisciplinary because I work in music spaces, I work in performance art spaces I work in theater spaces, and I, it's been like a great delight of mine to watch. If I think of my friend Bob Hatt, who is an amazing noise saxophonist, the way that he moves is like insane. It's crazy to me, right? But he's not a dancer, right? But he's a very embodied performer. And so I think about all those friends who are using their bodies in ways I don't even think they fully value or realize as well, and how much that would channel into this sort of expanded ideal of dance in a way that I'm like, the third answer to your question is I think I might already be doing some of it, because I get all of this information from all of these amazing artists I've been able to connect with, and my students as well. And I know you know this, right? Working with kids where it's like they
Yeah.
don't have these ingrained notions of what they should do with their body yet. Right. And when they're in that state, it's like, whoa, my God. It's so amazing to see the things they do.
Yeah, I mean, working with kids means constantly witnessing on miracle because even in the moments that they cannot do some movements or they are confused or they are lost, it's still very valuable and rich. So it is really a bliss for a teacher to be surrounded with these children's improvisation and their movements. Um, I think that is the moment where I feel the life is transforming, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the end of our podcast. Thanks for joining and sharing with us with these rich perspectives from different many layers. I feel really so honored to have you and sharing and listening your experience from different sides, from your family, from your education, from your professional life. I think it will speak to many colleagues from different angles. Thank you very much, Lichen, to being today with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I feel like I learned a lot from your perspective and your questions, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Dances of Us podcast. I hope you enjoyed our time together. Before we close, take a moment to check in with your body. How do you feel right now? Which parts wanted to move? Remember, the body holds stories, and it has the power to transform them too. I'm your host, Lerna Babikyan. Take care and see you next time.